Welcome to today's policy seminar, which is part of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture's 2021 month of March. My name's Mark Titterington, and I'm guiding us through this program of solutions workshops, policy seminars like this one, and of course our annual flagship conference. Together with our partners, we're exploring how to renew the global food and agriculture system to make it more resilient and sustainable. Enjoy today's event. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are joining us from in the world. It's a great pleasure to have you with us at this afternoon's Forum for the Future of Agriculture month of March program, and in particular our Policy Week seminar looking at transatlantic cooperation on how we renew and strengthen the food and agriculture system globally. As I just said, my name's Mark Titterington. I'm a co-founder and senior advisor to the forum, and I shall be your host and indeed moderator for this afternoon's event. Before we go any further, I want to introduce to you Peggy Yee, Managing Director of the Center for Global Food and Agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The Council is our international partner here at the forum. We are delighted to be working with them on this event. And Peggy has perhaps got the hardest job of the day, which will be to summarize the outcome of our debate and deliberations this afternoon. Well, as I said, the topic before us is transatlantic cooperation for research and innovation in the agri-food system, strengthening and renewing it. And I thought perhaps just to set the context of that, it might be worth just reflecting on a few of the challenges that the system faces in a number of different areas. As many of us know, we've got this dilemma between those that are undernourished and those that have perhaps too many calories. 800 million go to bed hungry every night, 2 billion suffer from micronutrient deficiencies, and yet by the same token, 2 billion people are said to be obese. We also throw away 1/3 of our food produced. In terms of biodiversity, upon which the food and agriculture system depends for its capacity to produce, we've, by some accounts, lost more than 60% of our biodiversity in the last 40 years or so. Climate change is already impacting the way that we produce through extreme weather events, forest fires and the like. And it's true to say that crop failures, of course, will often impact those that are poorest in the world, particularly those in the developing world. And when you look at those challenges together, they are at the same time humanitarian challenges, they are public health challenges, they are security challenges, they're economic development challenges, and they are, of course, climate change challenges. And then if we look at the demographics of our farming and rural communities, we see that there are more people living in urban spaces today than in rural areas. In many parts of the world, the average age of farmers is over 50, and that's relatively new in the human experience. Who will produce our food? Who will work the land? Who will expand the natural carbon sinks that we have in agriculture to fight climate change? How do we make our rural areas attractive, desirable for people to live in, to support those rural and farming businesses? These are just some of the challenges that I think we face. So there's a lot to do, a lot that can be done, and what we'll be addressing this afternoon is how, in particular, transatlantic cooperation can address some of those. In preparing for this afternoon's event, I was reminded of a paper that the forum's chairman, Yanis Potočnik, produced for the Transatlantic Policy Network not too long ago, where he talked about the United States and the European Union as, and I quote, masters of knowledge, ingenuity, innovation, and entrepreneurial spirit, possessing financial capability to effect change, to set standards and policy through which we can hold each other and indeed others in the world to account. Now, in many ways, given the challenges that we face, it seems clear that research and innovation is going to play a critical part in that, and it is worth reflecting again on the fact that Europe invests as much in research and innovation in the United States as any other country, and vice versa. The United States invests more in Europe than all other countries combined. So the potential, therefore, I think is huge to be a driver of innovation and adaptation, particularly in the area of food and agriculture, as we seek to strengthen the system. And that is what we will turn our attention to today. And to help us to do that, we have a truly impressive and highly distinguished panel of contributors with a wealth of experience and expertise to offer from a range of different perspectives. We'll hear from Florian Schattenmann, who's the Chief Technology Officer and Vice President for Innovation and Research and Development at Cargill. Michael Dunn, Global Managing Director for Sustainable Food and Water at the Nature Conservancy. Galina Pisheva, a Bulgarian landowner and certainly one of the most innovative farm managers that I've met in recent years, also the Vice Chairman of the Bulgarian Landowners Organization and on the Board of Directors of that country's Association of Agriculture Producers. And an old friend, Nicolae Stefanuta, Romanian member of the European Parliament, Vice President of the delegation on the Parliament's relations with the United States, and a member of the Parliament's Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, all eminently qualified to share with us their views on this topic. Now, before we start, I should be clear that this is your event. It's not mine, and your job, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to make my job redundant. To be able to do that, you'll need to put the questions in the chat function, or indeed in the question panel, drop-down panel on the right-hand side of the control panel. Say who you are, and I will endeavor to bring you into the discussion, and we will do our best to answer the questions that you put forward. And so to our first speaker today, it's both a pleasure and an honor, I have to say, to introduce to you Dan Glickman, a distinguished fellow of global food and agriculture at the Chicago Council. For 9 years, he co-chaired the Council's Global Food and Agriculture Program. But many of you will know him even better as a former US Secretary for Agriculture and for 18 years a member of Congress representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas. I can think of few who are better qualified than to lead us off this afternoon. And with that, Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that generous introduction. I'm really excited to be here at the FFA meeting with my distinguished colleagues who have joined us. For the past 4 years, I must tell you that I have seen a retrenchment of U.S. engagement in the world. Over that 4-year period, I believe the U.S. has pulled away from multilateral and international alliances and institutions, and that's been to the detriment of ourselves and America and our partners. And as the Biden administration gets its leadership in place and sets priorities, early indications show a significant reversal of this trend, and I think that is extremely positive. As you mentioned, I was the former Secretary of Agriculture. I was a member of Congress, and so I can tell you that the EU-US relationship generally is the most important relationship that we have in terms of everything collaborating on technology, defense, agriculture. Exports are massive between the US and the EU. We have been steadfast partners for a century, from the world wars to the fall of the Berlin Wall. But after 4 years of retrenchment, I know trust needs to be rebuilt and our partnership needs to be reinforced. And I'm here to try to do that as much as I can today, even though I'm not representing the US government anymore. But I think that the US government and foreign policy is moving in a positive direction. While the two powers, the EU and the US, have their points of contention, especially when it comes to some areas of regulation, I'm here today to say that agriculture research can and should be a key starting point from which to build a new era of collaboration. Agriculture research has been the foundation from which modern society is built. With advances in technology like mechanization, irrigation, precision agriculture, and advances in the understanding of soil health, climate, and weather patterns. These inventions have allowed our two societies to flourish and feed our growing populations. We have seen some of the greatest advances in modern history reflected in food. I would add that we are in the midst of this COVID epidemic. I'm adding this parenthetically. And we have made remarkable progress in the last year in terms of finding a vaccine and dealing with therapeutics when it comes to COVID. We know that much of that has been due to research both in agriculture and non-agriculture, in genetics and in new technologies. And these are things that at times can be controversial, but That research has produced vaccines which can save millions of lives. And we know there's a lot more to be done in research in the area of zoonotics, which is the transfer of diseases from animals to humans, and where COVID probably came from, and certainly where Ebola came from and everything else. So a lot of this research is just critical for the future of the human race, feeding the human race and keeping us healthy. But the advances have not always been distributed equitably. The current pandemic has exacerbated the weaknesses in our global food system, widening nutritional gaps and thrusting an additional 150 million people in the world into food insecurity. Economic ripple effects of a country and continent-wide lockdown also threaten food security. It's coming back again. We thought we had put that to rest. And in some countries, particularly in Europe, we see it happening again, and putting more people at risk of malnutrition. The crisis is not just relegated to low and middle income countries. Currently in the US, more than 14 million households still struggle with food insecurity. Food bank lines have stretched for miles, and the longer the pandemic lasts, the more entrenched our problems become. Now, the United States Congress and the President have recently passed a major COVID package, which adds significant money, billions and billions of dollars, into help for people who are food insecure. But the problem will remain as long as the pandemic exists. While investment in agriculture research cannot solve immediate humanitarian needs, it can begin to answer some critical questions on how we can strengthen our food system to withstand acute shocks like a pandemic, or a natural disaster, or major climate change, or other things, in addition to other crises and the interlocking health issues that lead to poor nutrition. Investment in agriculture research, especially as it relates to nutrition and health, could be a true silver bullet when working to address chronic food and nutrition insecurity. Malnutrition is an especially insidious issue. It is not just about the number of calories people eat, but the quality of those calories. Many countries are facing the double burden of rising healthcare costs from both a lack of nutrition, which causes stunting, and overnutrition, which leads to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and many other diseases. In fact, rates of obesity and diabetes have skyrocketed across the world. Diet-related diseases have become the leading cause of poor health and preventable healthcare spending in the world. In 2016, the direct and indirect costs of chronic diseases in the United States as a result of obesity were $1.7 trillion, almost 10% of the nation's gross national product. And frankly, Europe and the developing world do not fare that much better. 2.5 billion adults suffer from some version of malnutrition, and 225 million children under 5 are afflicted as well. This is data from April 20th, which is prior to the pandemic. These numbers have no doubt risen and will continue to rise without concerted intervention. Agriculture research provides an opportunity to better address how to get healthy food to people who need it the most. Collaboration between the EU and the US on this critical issue, the relationship between agriculture, nutrition, and health, could truly help us start this decade on the right foot. In fact, there are already examples of how this can change the world. The CGIAR system is a perfect illustration of how governments can collaborate to fund agriculture research with global benefits. CGIAR is a global research partnership dedicated to reducing poverty, enhancing food and nutrition security, and improving natural resources. Their research labs span the globe, with headquarters in France and a policy research hub in Washington, D.C. The European Commission and the United States are two of the largest donors to this research mission, and the lab themselves hosts some of the greatest agriculture scientists from Europe, the US, and around the world. The success of the CGIARs, from creating 3D printing techniques for agriculture machinery spare parts in lower and middle income countries, to better understanding climate impacts on key Bangladeshi crops, show that despite what seems like intractable differences in our agendas, there is always room for collaboration. Knowing the massive challenges our globe will face in the coming years, from climate change to diet health to destruction of pests and animal disease and many other things. It is critical that we continue to find ways to work together. And I thank you very much for allowing me to make these remarks.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much indeed for all those comments. A couple of follow-up questions, if I may. I mean, the figures you quote there are truly extraordinary, and yet, for whatever reason, beyond perhaps events like these, and in certain pockets of the research community and maybe even government circles, they seem to remain largely hidden. How do we surface those wider external costs for society to understand, and so we can start to take wider responsibility for solving them?
It's a very good question. A couple of things. Number one is the total budget for agriculture research in the world is not going up. In the United States, it's actually coming down in real terms. Some countries, China and Brazil, there is some increase, but in Europe and the United States, you don't really see the kind of priority given to agriculture research that needs to have happen. The second thing I would tell you is there needs to be a better relationship between food, agriculture, and health. Napoleon once said that war is too important to be left to the generals. And I have basically said that agriculture and agriculture research is too important just to be left to those in agriculture. If what that another French philosopher said, you are what you eat, then in fact, we could get the medical community and the political community more engaged in food production and food issues. I think it would certainly be helpful. For years and years, agriculture and food issues were not on the agendas of the G7 and the G20. They were viewed as secondary issues. And I think our job is to try to put them up there to the level that they need to be.
Yeah, that's quite right. Couldn't agree with that more. You also said something else in your introductory remarks there that certainly resonated with me. Do you think that, I mean, we've got great universities in Europe, we've got great universities in the US that are working on this. Do you think that the COVID crisis has reminded us truly that research can and should be global in order to address global challenges, and will bring more of a coming together of those institutions, so perhaps we work less in isolation or less geographically and more globally?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. The great land grant universities in the United States, the great universities in Europe, and frankly, great universities in China who have expanded their research capabilities rather dramatically, are doing extraordinary work. But the amount of collaboration has been somewhat impeded by political barriers that have taken place. And we have differences with other countries and other people on some items, but when it comes to feeding the world sustainably, dealing with these challenges of climate, dealing with the challenges of health that I talked about before, we're all in this together. And the classic example is COVID. COVID's global. What happens in one part of the world affects everybody else. We once had an American philosopher named Will Rogers. He said, America has two of the greatest friends of the world. They're the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Well, yeah. He might have had a good idea 150 years ago, but it's not true anymore.
Yeah, air travel certainly sort of that. I just want to go back to where you were at the beginning of your speech, and you talked about the importance of trust. And I don't necessarily want to get into the last 4 years, so to speak. You can look at it two ways. You can say that the trust built up over the last 70, 75 years between Europe and America means that the institutional framework of the relationship enables things to progress, and we can come back from setbacks, whether in Europe or the United States. But the challenges in the food and agriculture system are long-term. They go beyond presidential cycles and terms of office for European Commission. So, from where you sit now, how confident are you that trust can be rebuilt and we can put in place actions that will sustain themselves regardless of changes of administration in the future, or indeed changes of commissions?
I'm actually pretty optimistic. Even the last 4 years, and I hope I didn't let my partisan biases show through, but I assume I did.
Not at all.
But I actually believe that those institutions are strong, and especially as we face what I call the asteroids, or the challenges of the future that could come in and really be destructive to this planet and to the people. So when it comes to soil health, when it comes to water utilization, when it comes to human health, when it comes to productivity of crops and livestock, I mean, these are issues that shouldn't be political at all. And yeah, there are some differences on some issues, but better minds need to be prevailing. And I'm looking much more positively now to the future. But it is built on a good, strong foundation, as you point out, since the Second World War.
It's great. Well, thank you very much indeed for setting the right direction, I think, for our discussion today. No doubt we'll be back to you a little bit later, but for now, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much indeed for your introductory remarks.
Thank you.
We'll cross the Atlantic, so to speak, and go to Nikolai Stefanuta, member of the European Parliament. I know a committed transatlanticist from the time and interaction that you and I have spent together, Niku. And I know that climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, and how that impacts on the food and agriculture system is some elements that are very close to your heart. And so we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us about your perspective on that and how transatlantic cooperation can help. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mark. And I apologize to the rest of the participants that you can only see me in a picture. I promise to be just as good looking in reality and as the picture shows. But it was a pleasure to listen to Secretary Glickman. I could have not, I'm not sure when was the last time when I concurred on so many ideas with somebody. From my professional work, I used to work on the Committee on Agriculture of the European Parliament. We did many transatlantic trips to the House Committee on Agriculture. We met secretaries of agriculture and so on. And then recently I was working on transatlantic relations, lastly posted in Washington. And then I became a member of the European Parliament, to the chagrin of my Texas wife, who wishes we were back in Washington and we never entered politics, but here I am. And ever since then, I've been working on environmental issues. And I listened to Secretary Glickman about what he said, and I strongly believe these are the challenges that we have had together as super close allies. I do believe I'm going to speak more today about global deforestation and the cost of imported deforestation, because both of our economies rely a lot on imported les entrants. How do you say les entrants? The stuff that goes into production, and feed. Yes, obviously feed, and we rely a lot on soy. It comes from Brazil. You guys are better with it than we are. As you know, there's a soil a cultivation ban for GMO soil on European soil, something that has affected countries, including my own, Romania, that depended very strongly on GM soy. However, ever since our entry into the European Union, that was no longer an option, so we depend on imported soy. When you say imported soy, you usually speak about two sources, either the United States or Brazil. And Brazil has been deforesting a lot in order to create agricultural fields for soy production, and that has accelerated under President Bolsonaro. Not only that, but encroachments into the natural wildlife, into forests, into the Amazon forest, etc. This is accelerating, and this is a major concern in the European Union. In addition to our own desire to tax all the other nations that do not have the leadership on a reduction of emissions by way of imposing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I think that will be a huge transatlantic discussion going ahead, because the target is obviously not the United States. The target are the nations that do not respect nature and do not respect that do not have any kind of respect towards sustainability and so on. And we have to differentiate, because if we impose an emissions target as we do in the European Union, and we let nevertheless imported products that do not respect that same, the European consumer will feel somehow unjustly taxed. So carbon border adjustment mechanism will come. Today I will speak more about commodity-driven deforestation, because that is an area where I worked on, and as I said, commodity-driven deforestation contributes a lot to a number of concerns like loss of biodiversity, wildfires, increasing land degradation, desertification, and severe drought. I saw The Economist spoke about already a scenario in 2050 where if we continue this current rate of desertification and nature loss, the entire south of Europe will potentially not be inhabitable. So for us, it is a real and tangible concern. But we also think about the external nations, and especially as this expansion into nature, wildlife conservatories and so on is driven by national demand for agricultural commodities, but also by international demand. And we believe that the European Union and the United States, they both share responsibilities for this environmental loss. And we are very happy that the Biden administration has shown leadership in coming back to the table, claiming back a leadership seat that normally and naturally belongs to the United States. And we do hope that we see America more active on some of the forest risk commodities, such as soy, on the international scene. Now, all of this might seem quite leftist or liberal to you. I'm not sure if it is, but in Europe, we have a very, very realistic paradigm shift. We really take these things seriously, and we want to shift our entire economy towards sustainability. And for that, we implemented the European Green Deal, loaded with a lot of money. It's about 1.8 trillion in general. Well, that's our budget plus our borrowed means for the future, for which there will be own resources engaged, etc. But we do want to see more cooperation between the European Green Deal and the American version, whatever it will be. I don't want to use the term Green Deal, because the new Green New Deal, because that's politically loaded, and I think the administration will have its own plan for that. But we do want, and I'm the person who really believes in that we have to work together on this. And we have to work together on combating consumption-driven deforestation as part of our joint EU-US joint strategy, conservation of biodiversity. I would say, lots of Europeans think they do better than the United States on many things. I think on conservation, America does better, because you have started earlier. You have started under President Roosevelt, Teddy, and it's continued ever since. Unfortunately, we already lost lots of our biodiversities that will never come back, but the little we have should be protected. And we don't want to see other places of the world being affected by the same as we have in the past. So I'm actually very eager to hear one more point I had about the EU timber regulation. Wood is not just for carbon storage. Obviously, it's also a commodity. But we have been pretty ruthless, and we continue to be ruthless on any illegal logging activities. This is something that is very passionate to me in lots of Eastern European states, where illegal logging happens, and lots of old growth forests and so on are being illegally logged. But also in terms to third countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, and others, where maybe we want to work together to establish a framework due diligence, with other instruments in place for companies that profit from it in the agricultural value chain. So once again, thank you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me. Maybe I'm not the #1 agricultural specialist, but I do kind of have a background for it, and I care a lot about sustainable measures. One last point. Every time I go to the States, I'm surprised when Europeans are surprised when they hear we have the highest standards in the world, food standards in the world, because we say, wait a minute, it's us that have the highest food standards in the world. Well, maybe we just realize we're closer than we think. Maybe we both have the highest food standards in the world, and we are actually closer than we sometimes like to think.
It's a great point to finish on, if I may say so, Nikolai. And here I'm going to put a question to you, but also bring Secretary Glickman back into this, because I wonder whether or not, without going into necessarily the regulatory challenges of the past, have we done enough to build understanding between the two systems in terms of standards and policies that have been adapted? We will have a session on Tuesday afternoon where we look at global Europe into the global environment, and the global environment back into Europe. It'll close our annual conference. In Europe, we've developed the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy. I wonder if the two of you feel that we do anywhere near enough to have an exchange on the ideas and the development of those policies before they emerge, in order to be able to ensure that perhaps there's greater compatibility, or perhaps you will describe me as being hopelessly naive. Nikolai, maybe first to you and then to the Secretary.
No, it's not. We used to have these dialogues. I mean, I come from an era where I thought TTIP would be a thing, and I fought for it. And before TTIP, there was like a tech council, transatlantic economic council, and things like that. So I kind of know the history. And I always wished for a big old transatlantic agreement to take place. When we launched TTIP, we weren't in a position to close it. I think the society wasn't, both on your side and our side, even though the American society was more open to a transatlantic pact than to a trans-Pacific pact. I remember from the data proposed. However, we weren't smart enough to conclude it when there was a window of opportunity. So here we are. We have to talk about. We are back to the 1950s of trade policy, if I may say. I mean, where we stick it to the other person with different tariffs on wine or cheese or beef, and it's not cool. I don't find it funny whatsoever. I think we should go back to a true transatlantic relationship of trust, because, as I said, we're closer than any two partners in this world, just because we are and we have similar concerns. So we haven't done enough. No, Mark, I don't think we have done enough, and I think more could be done. Also, I'm trying to educate the European public about several misconceptions they have. In Germany, misconceptions about America dominate misconceptions about China, if you can believe it, or so it's pretty it's pretty bad. And not only there, I think in the US it's kind of the same. Depends on who you ask. So yeah. I think we should work and bring the public back on this. And I'm one of the politicians, albeit very young and unknown, etc. But I'm ready to put my part in this.
Oh, it's good to hear. Mr. Secretary, from your point of view, from the US side, have we done enough to understand? Have the two sides done enough? I know politics is local, but also increasingly global. And some of the things that Nikolai talked about there, whether it is farm to fork strategy or carbon tax adjustment mechanisms that ensure that we're not simply exporting sustainability challenges. Is there more scope to increase the dialogue?
Well, first of all, I think if Nikolai and I got together, we could probably work everything out. So he sounds like a very reasonable person. And I see his picture is right down the street from the U.S. Capitol, and it's where I used to work. So Nikolai, hopefully one of these days you and I can get together and work through some of these things. You know, we have entered this, the last several years, we had this period of increasing nationalism, and some call it populism, and it's created a less favorable environment towards open trade. Granted, we're always going to do some protection of our own products. That's just the nature of the beast, and it's why we have separate countries. But the collaboration on trade is hopefully will strengthen, especially between the U.S. and Europe. I also think the collaboration on technology has to strengthen. You know, I look at these COVID vaccines. We've 2 of these vaccines, maybe more, but the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine are basically based upon, they're an RNA-based vaccine. Genetic engineering had a lot to do with creating these vaccines that may save tens of millions of people. And somehow we need to get together and talk sensibly about how we can accept these new technologies, properly regulated, of course, again, properly protecting consumers, but at the same time recognizing that we can't really deal with these challenges of climate and health without accepting new technologies and being unafraid to do the research necessary to deal with them. And I think that's an area that really desperately needs a bit more collaboration, especially between the US and Europe.
Yeah. Would fully endorse that, and I can just imagine that Florian in particular will want to respond to that when we turn to him in a few moments. And before we do, one of the challenges of these events is that we can all talk at a very high level, but we need to bring it down to the farm level and understand what this might mean for a land manager, landowner, a farmer. And I can think of nobody better to offer her perspective on this than Galina Pesheva. Galina, you also come from a part of Europe where technology can play a critical role, both on the farm and, as we've talked about before, off the farm, and strengthening rural communities, making them attractive and vibrant places to live. So we'd love to hear your perspective on all of this, as how transatlantic cooperation might help someone like you.
Well, in my humble opinion, the EU and the US can cooperate to renew the agri-food and agriculture system by working together on promoting and scaling regenerative farming. Very broadly speaking, regenerative agriculture is a conservation and rehabilitation approach to food and farming systems. Both the EU and the US have witnessed increased consumer demand for transparency and a multitude of labels and initiatives targeted towards sustainable food production. At the same time, we farmers do business like any other business people, no matter if the farm is in Kansas or in Bulgaria. So we assess risk, profit, and try to predict favorable outcomes. For a traditional farmer, both in the US and the EU, farming for healthy soils, ecosystems, communities, and climate conflicts at many points with conventional agricultural practice. It's understandable because most farmers grew up with the dominant conventional narrative that profits are solely tied to yields. Conventional agriculture in both the EU and the US benefits from the existing model, which has been providing training and support to farmers, driving a feedback loop of conventional crops and dominant metrics of yields. Regenerative farming, on the other hand, may well produce lower yields, but that does not necessarily equate to lower profits. In fact, farms with established regenerative practices can be more profitable than those with only conventional practices. Rather than the current one-size-fits-all approach across vastly different landscapes and climates across the EU and the United States, regenerative farming demands regionally specific knowledge that is grounded in the particular crops grown within local climates and soils. Nature-positive farmers may give up some yield while making more profit by growing higher margin crops and reducing costly inputs, The problem is, and there is always a problem, that it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and considerable trial and error to get from conventionally to economically successful regenerative farming. Our 1,200-hectare farm is the poster example of a successful nature-positive business. We are profitable, we are sustainable, and we do way more than is required from us without sacrificing what's good for the environment. However, I must assure you that it didn't happen overnight, and it took almost 10 years to gradually find out what works out for us and what doesn't. The trial and error approach is costly and time consuming, and we made many unnecessary steps along the way. It took a lot of courage, perseverance, and time to get here, and as proud as I am of what we have achieved, I'm also a realist when it comes to its scalability. I can vouch from experience that farmers will need practical evidence that nature-positive approach will work before they try it on a larger scale. They will need models for what it actually looks like in their own region, and only when they come, see, touch the crops, they will actually believe that it is possible. Also, a few balance sheets will help greatly. But we can work to build resilient farms and communities by hosting programs and field days, conducting on-farm research rooted in farmer questions, and building a peer-to-peer network of farmers exchanging knowledge and experience. The US is a highly technological country, so the technology from the US can be exported to the EU to help accelerate the process. Scaling the practice will also require the cumulative impact of many individual farmers changing their own farm practices. Farmers are rightfully worried of the barriers to transition to regenerative agriculture, the cost and the risk associated with the adoption of a completely different way of doing business. One thing I see as a solution is that there should be active and widespread support for sustainable farmers. The transition cost must be shared in order to lower the bill for adopting conservation practices. Our society should acknowledge and compensate nature-positive farmers by sharing the burden of the cost of good land stewardship. As governments seek to enforce the Green Deal in a sustainable way, and the European Commission and the US government are charting very ambitious climate strategies, decision makers should consider establishing regenerative farming as a legitimate path towards a sustainable agricultural future. Thank you.
Galina, I knew that would be good, and you didn't disappoint. A couple of questions to follow up, if I may. I mean, you clearly believe in regenerative farming, but let me just throw a question at you. I mean, it is, you can almost not turn farm media either in the United States or in Europe now and not hear about regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming practices, nature positive farming. Are we sure it's real and it's not just another buzzword? From a grower perspective, you believe in this?
I actually do it, so I'm sure it works. The problem is, Mark, it's like taking supplements. Sometimes what works with your friend doesn't work for you. So you really have to go through a few years of trial and error. You have to try things, and sometimes you cannot bear the economic cost of it. But yes, I truly believe, and I've seen it on my farm, both on the balance sheet and on the field, that this works. We have up to 8 different crops. We do no-till. We use nitrogen fixing and ammonia and phosphorus fixing bacteria in our soils, and we combine a lot of measures in order to receive this cumulative effect of a regenerative farm. It's not one size fits all approach, and it definitely needs some tuning. That's why I said that bringing it locally to farmers that are close to you, fence farming, let's put it that way, is the way to convince farmers. And this actually came from the US. The entire no-till minimum disturbance ideology came from the US, and it was adopted in Europe, especially in Bulgaria, in the last 10 or 12 years. Before that, we haven't heard about it at all.
Yeah, quite right. And I know my own experience of working in that region certainly lends itself to this. Galina, you've got a very senior representative, senior leader from Cargill on today's panel. You've got a former U.S. Secretary for Agriculture. You've got Nicu Stefanutra in the European Parliament. No offense to you at all, Michael, but three people there that have been or still could do something for you. What do you need from them that would make regenerative farming work for you?
Like I said, establishing it as a legitimate path towards a sustainable agricultural future by putting it in some perspective, I don't know how to say it legally, through the Commission or through the US government, is the way to go. We have to support the trial and error period when farmers will struggle and will inevitably make mistakes. If we want to scale this beyond the 5% that can afford to buy very well produced, very expensive, sustainable food.
Very good. Thank you indeed, Galina. I should have said that question also came from the audience. And if other people want to get into the discussion here with the panel, please put your questions in the chat or in the question panel. So we'll turn now to Michael. So I didn't want to steal your thunder by throwing that question to you. TNC plays a critical role in terms of helping to define some of the definitions around this. You've been intensely involved right around the world in practical applications of building a more resilient and sustainable food and agriculture environment. I wonder, from your point of view, what transatlantic cooperation can mean in, again, setting direction and perhaps helping to build collaboration, skills, technology transfer, and the like. Michael, looking forward as always to hearing what you have to say. Might be on mute, Michael.
Sorry, so technology always gets us right there. Thank you, Mark, for the very kind introduction and the invitation to join this esteemed panel. And I think it's just such an important topic, and we're privileged to weigh in with a few ideas here. First, I want to just follow up the wonderful presentation by Galina and just say we agree. We couldn't agree more in the central role that farmers must be the solution providers in this play. Many of us can be helpful. We want to be more helpful. We want to help remove barriers. We want to encourage producers and farmers to act with more intention and precision around these issues, but they have to get the right signals, the right policy signals, the right market signals, the right technology to make these transitions. So we start with farmers as central to the solution on the environmental agenda for the issues that we care about, many of which have already been voiced on this panel. Just to pick up a relevant example on this, in the US, where we do have a strong presence on the ground, and we started almost a decade ago working with farmers to evaluate the issue of healthy soils. We started with a group of farm associations to study the issue carefully, knowing that there's still unanswered questions. And so we now have a network of 200 demonstration farms where farmers are leading the way, implementing new practices for healthy soils. We're collecting data, we're publishing that data, we're learning together. That process has evolved into, I think, a new platform of trust, emerging trust that has given rise to some very encouraging new policy movements. The Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, which was newly announced and is now engaging pretty deeply with the new administration in the US to think about policy that can drive these actions forward. the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, which is really looking at a very bold vision for turning agriculture into a net sink in a meaningful amount of time. So we're very privileged to work closely with farmers, and we see farmers as central to the solution. Second, we need a new food economy, and we can speak a lot about this. I thought the presentation by the MEP was right on the mark. We can't export between the US and Europe. We can't export our footprint to the rest of the world. We have the means to make improvements in our own food system, and we need to lead the way in doing that. Back to the issue of healthy soils. 5 years ago, we published an analysis that showed, yes, farmers actually enjoy, just as Galina has mentioned. But guess what? The benefits are 6 to 7 times greater for society in terms of resilience on water management, flood, drought management, nutrient management and cycling, and climate mitigation. So these issues are not priced into the food system today. We need to solve that. And that's one of the reasons that we're interested in this issue. We kind of consider ourselves nature's economists, and we want to make sure that we're investing in the practices and technologies that will help us unlock nature so she can help us manage these issues. Third, it takes us over to innovation, and I know that's central to the discussion here today. Simply put, we have to get past some of the old thinking on it's either the environment or innovation. These are not on separate paths. They can actually flow together. We need the best thinking of modern practices, including better genetics, better digital tools, to integrate with what we know about ecosystem adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptations, starting with managing for healthy soils, managing for healthy biodiversity and clean water, integrated into highly intensive food production areas. So we're very interested in where innovation can take us, and that means that we need to innovate around governance on innovation and begin to bring these ideas in, the benefit accounting to society for novel innovations that can move our food system forward. With that, I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. There's so much to go at. I'm just going to focus on where you left it. I mean, and it picks up a question I've got in the chat here on trying to define what we mean by regenerative agriculture. So, given the fact that the US and the European Union is clearly taking a strong interest in regenerative farming, certainly we see it, referenced in farm to fork strategy, along the lines of carbon farming. It's referenced or reflected in the common agriculture policy. We see it on the other side of the Atlantic. Is there not a need for, or an opportunity for both sides to come together and say, that's what we believe regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming is, and that's the technologies that we need, and that's the knowledge exchange that we need, and here's the benefits we think it can deliver. Isn't there an opportunity to do that?
Yes, and I know that there will be a lot of desire to define the term regenerative in this context, and we will certainly welcome that. That exploration will lead us, I think, into some very good outcomes here. But the way we think about it is regenerative at its core is about nature positive. It's about seeing the food system not just as a set of hard trade-offs to make, but an opportunity for renewal. Here we have a management interval, a set of actors on the landscape who have precision and knowledge, and if we can help them in the restoration of soils and watersheds and biodiversity, it becomes an economy that starts to pay for the restoration we need on the planet. And so regenerative in our way of thinking isn't about a technology definition so much as it's about the investment in renewal through the food system. Great
answer, Michael. Not surprisingly. I want to throw something else back at you, which picks up a little bit on what Secretary Glickman said at the beginning. And Florin, you might want to keep your ears open for this one too, because I might have the same question for you as well. to simplify it, not saying that I agree with it, but to simplify it, there is a question about whether there's a trade-off between low-cost food and true cost food. And as you kind of described yourself, nature's economists, when you've got people going to bed hungry, you've got people queuing for food banks, we're likely to have an economy that is a global economy that's going to suffer the impacts of COVID. How do we reconcile the lower cost of food with the true cost of food? Any thoughts on that, Michael? I hate to put you on the spot.
No, it's exactly where I'd enjoy being in a panel like this. This is the debate that we need to have. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know if, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now, yeah.
Can you hear me, Mark?
I can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Somehow the line across the pond.
That's broken
I'm so
up
sorry.
again.
Is my internet connection stable?
It is at the moment. I'll give you another go at that. No.
Okay, so sorry about that. I doing my best here.
No worries. I tell you what, Michael, we'll try and come back to you. I know you're not trying to avoid answering my question.
Okay.
We'll come back. Florian, so, Michael's talked a lot about governance and getting past perhaps some of the hurdles that we've had, mindset hurdles that we've had in the past about technology and getting in the hands of the people that need it. Galina, certainly touched on that, and Secretary Glickman made the reference to it. So from your point of view at Cargill, and particularly given your role, Florian, what would you want from renewed transatlantic cooperation, particularly in this area? How's that going to help a company like Cargill?
Great. Let me first of all start off with thanking you for being part of this discussion today. When you're the last speaker, a lot of the points and the case for change has been made so eloquently and so consistently, so that's terrific. But maybe to some degree, Mark, this rings even more true personally. I spent exactly half of my life growing up in Munich, Germany, and now spent the other half in the United States in various companies, and for the last 2.5 years at Cargill. So for me, this coming together and solving these issues that I think Dan and Michael and Galina and really everyone has outlined so well, they're global issues. So there's one planet, and these issues cannot be dealt differently from country to country. So I'm responsible for R&D and innovation. So my heart, again, which is about solving these challenges. And so the way we view this as Cargill is that everything going forward, we have to address them via innovation and R&D, and we can't actually do it alone. A lot of this has to be done in partnerships, and I think that's where I'm going to take some of the discussion. So, and I think Dan made that point really well. This entire food versus health, right? Via the microbiome, the gut health, and those kind of things, it is all connected. And if we don't solve these, and they will not solve themselves, we have to actively spend some funds here in R&D. And so let me just take how a company like Cargill, and Cargill, for those that it's not as known in outside of the US, we're the largest player in the food and ag space. We're one of the largest privately held companies on the planet with 155,000 employees, and actually are 155 years young. So we play in this space for a long time, and we feel a responsibility to be really at the forefront on making some of those changes happen, as we cover everything from the farm to the fork, and we even supply to the farms. So let me just give a couple of examples to bring it to life, what we're trying to do and what we're doing with others around sustainability, healthy nutrition, and digitalization in ag. And I thought the rest of the panel has done an outstanding job to set the stage for some of those things. In sustainability, it has been very clear, maybe 15, 20 years, the focus was on energy production and transportation and so on. It is firmly on food and ag now. There is no doubt about that. from investors, consumers, customers, everyone. And it's really part of our purpose. Our purpose is to nourish the world in a sustainable, safe, and responsible way. And so one example is in Europe, in Belgium and Netherlands, where we work with soil capital on more sustainable regenerative ag practices to really help reduce the carbon footprint. On our beef supply chain in North America, which is actually already the most sustainable one, we declared Beef Up, which is 30% reduction in greenhouse gases in the next 10 years or 9 years now. And just a couple of weeks ago, we put a stake in the ground, said we're going to do the same thing in seafood, in salmon farming. So we are committed. In all of those, we work with partners together, and I think that is really where the strengths come in. And it's also, we distribute this globally. The second part is healthy nutrition, and I think that came up really well already, and I'm glad to hear it that way. And to get to some of those UN Sustainability Development Goals around nutrition, there's no way companies like Cargill can stand on the sidelines, if you want, right? And one area I want to just show is the protein gap. We project over the next 30 years a 70% increase in protein consumption. The planet size is fixed, as we all know. If anything, urbanization and population growth will put stress on farmers like Galina and with less land and so on. So how do we solve about that, right? And we feel that there's not going to be one solution in the short term that will solve everything. It'll be a battery, a series of approaches that will help. One is that we're going to have to bring more plant-based protein products into the market and really switch some of us consume. We have done this for decades now on the ingredient side, but we also really jumped now full force into the meat analog side, plant-based. The second one is around, we have made some seed investments in cellular protein. That is another viable option to be explored, right? And so Memphis Meat in the US, that is a leading company around that, but also in Israel and Aleph Farms, which has some scaffolding, 3D dimensional structure. So some really exciting. And we can never let the eyes off the animal protein production, right? What can we do there to make that better, to increase sustainability of that? And I think that is those are all extremely important areas. I think somebody mentioned it. We got to get the universities more involved. So we are a founding member with the Plant Protein Innovation Center, which is headquartered at the University of Minnesota, which is in our backyard. But it also has key scientific minds of the University of Wageningen in Netherlands. And so it is a transatlantic effort, and it has to be a transatlantic effort. It has to be cutting across. And so we see, we're quite hopeful how we're gonna start addressing those things. Finally, digitalization, that is an area that's gonna just come like a tidal wave into our industry, into the ag, into the food space. AI, drones, computer vision, whatever you have, it's going to be a real differentiator. We are working actually with Michael and the Nature Conservancy on really some smart solutions, some smart irrigation, right? How can we really reduce water consumption during irrigation? IoT, the Internet of Things kind of things, unique sensors, and so those kind of things. A really great collaboration. And finally, we as a last example, because I'm running out of time here a little bit, we have invested in a company in Ireland called Kindness that is going away from hard sensors. It actually uses facial recognition, but for cows, to really drill and optimize for the individual need of a cow. And so now again, you can optimize feed and land use and all these kind of things to really get better at that. As I said, this is such a critical panel, and in a critical time. I think the next 10 years will also be the time where biotech will come with force into the food and ag space, and it will be able to create some new opportunities, but also some new cost-effective ways. I think this panel couldn't be more timely, and I'm really excited to be part of it. And big companies, organizations like the Nature Conservancy, and of course the governments, and how they incentivize and how they cut across the globe and view this as a global opportunity and challenge and problem. How we all act together is the only chance for us to win.
That's great, Florian. Thanks so much indeed. And I'm not surprisingly, your intervention has generated quite a few questions in the chat you're going to come to. I can't not make reference to the facial recognition technology for the cows. My own family's involved in cattle farming, and it's just so cool. Just from a boys' toys kind of perspective, I'm fascinated by that. Let me ask you a question though, Florian, just to kind of kick this off, and then I might go back to Secretary Glickman. How easy is it for a company like yours to form global partnerships with research institutions, universities in Europe and in the United States, and get them to work together to produce some of the research and innovation that you need? Is it easy? Is it gotten better? Is it getting harder? Just a sense of where that is.
Yeah, so great question. We have an almost equal global footprint, right? More than 30% of our sales are in Asia and so on. So we really cover the world well. Within a region, it is relatively easy to make connections. I think where we're going to have to push harder, and I would say some of the universities like Singapore, they're becoming much more globally focused. They have now different kind of outposts in parts of the world. But I think collaborations like what we see with the Plant Protein Innovation Center, we have to encourage them. We have to actually probably work with policy making to make those easier and cut across, because sometimes there's intellectual property and all these kind of things that come in the way. And I think we have to act more modern around this, as I said, because some of these projects, these challenges are global. Overall, my hopeful, optimistic mindset is telling me that I think the global community is coming closer together, but we will need a nudge across.
Yeah. By the way, you can take this on or not, but one of the audience members has just asked if you can make the facial recognition app for the cows available for free. I'll leave you to decide how you want to respond to that. Mr. Secretary, I come back to you. One of the reasons that we've been able to mobilize public and private research on COVID, perhaps, is because it's in the here and now. With stretched budgets and everything, how do we make the case, whether you're in the US or in Europe, for more public spending on agriculture and food research? I think you're on mute. Can we unmute Dan? Can anybody hear Dan, or is it just me?
No, I think unfortunately I cannot hear him.
Hang on, let's have a look and see what we can do with that. 1 second.
Now I'm okay. Now you can hear me.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, I think. So first of all, I just have to say that I have a special affinity for Cargill because they were a very, very big part of my old congressional district. Their meat division was headquartered in Wichita, Kansas. So I can't say anything. It still is. I knew that division before it was Cargill. I want you to know that. So, and also the second thing is Cargill is a great participant in humanitarian assistance around the world. They're very big involved in the World Food Program and global hunger issues in Latin America. It's an example of good corporate citizenship that I think should be replicated across the board, but they're a real leader in this. I just, in terms of research, you're absolutely right. When you have a crisis, it's easy to get research. We moved amazingly fast on COVID. It's just incredible. And some animal diseases we've moved very fast on. And when you have some of the pest diseases we've moved fast on. So, but we haven't moved very fast, for example, in terms of better use of water utilization, because 70% of the water in the world is used to irrigate crops and feed animals. Okay, my goodness gracious, we know that because of climate and weather, that's becoming just a massive problem. And it's slow until it really hits you in the form of a drought or a flood, or what happened in Texas where all the plumbing systems froze up, and then then we get excited about it. So it is a real problem, and that's where the public research is so important. The private research that the companies do generally is for their economic benefit, which it should be, and that's why governments have massive research programs, and you have the CGIAR system that does a lot of this stuff too. But in real terms, the developing world, the developed world, particularly Europe and the United States, has not done a very good job recently in the last 10 years in funding public research, and it just needs to be a higher priority. And that may be because food and agriculture itself hasn't been a high priority in the political circles when they meet in Munich or London or Washington on other issues.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that point that we have to look at it holistically, a health challenge, a security challenge, and as well as a humanitarian and indeed a climate challenge, and bring all those things into play. It always surprises me, though, I have to say. I mean, when I think about the agri-food sector in Europe, it's probably the biggest employer, well, certainly one of the biggest contributors to the economic well-being of the continent. So you think it should be somewhere close to the top of people's agenda, and maybe we all just need to make a bigger effort to ensure that it is.
I would just make one quick point, and that is, in the U.S., the National Institutes of Health has not had much negative public perception in terms of research. So the government has continued to fund that because it affects people's lives. So the National Cancer Institute, it gets significant additional funding every year. Why? Because every one of us can see the benefit of that in terms of medicines and therapeutics, and it's why COVID got so much funding in the thing. And I think what we have to do is better relate to the public the benefits of food and agriculture research, so they see that. I used to say, when we had these arguments on GMOs, whether we should have them or not, and I'm in favor of genetic engineering, again, properly regulated, that if they could find a GMO that would allow me to grow hair on my head, I guarantee you that everybody in the world over the age of 50 years old would be in favor of this thing. I mean, Michael doesn't have to worry about it, but some of the rest of us do. I guess my point is that unless you have a crisis, it's hard to get people to focus on research, particularly in food and agriculture.
Yeah, quite right. Thank you for that. Florian, I'm going to come back to you with one quick question which might be more challenging, but I think it's worth taking on. One of the audience is saying, shortening of supply chains as a sustainable practice is directly in conflict with the business model of a company like Cargill. How do they approach calls for such transitions? So yeah, I give that to you to answer.
I mean, we still feel that if you have a free market and make sure that where the biggest need is also how the supply chain moves, is the way to go. Now, how will this play out over the next 10, 15 years remains to be seen. But I think for us it's more important to not having a lot of protectionism and so on, and make sure that we find the most efficient and effective ways. And honestly, we are spending a lot of time now making even the shipping, our shipping, way more sustainable. We have invested in there, and it just wasn't enough time to come with all those kind of examples today. But the idea is to make the system overall as efficient as possible. To some degree, a lot of the shortcoming in food is also based on waste generated, that if we can reduce that will help also, right? I mean, to your earlier question. So we view that, and it's, what is the right answer? We view that as you have the most flexible, most efficient system, and focus on the greenhouse gas footprint and the sustainability of that system. If you combine those two, you will probably have the best path forward.
That's good. Okay, I'm actually being flooded with questions now, which is great, and I can't get to all of them. There's a desire to hear Michael come back on that low cost versus true cost of food. If your mic is back on, I'm gonna hand it back to you. Should we try?
Let's try it. Can you hear me, Mark?
Go ahead. Try again. No, I don't think it. Well, it worked better then. One more time.
I don't know. I guess I'm making the case for technology.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to ask you to type that one out. So
I'll shout louder. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's broken up. All right, one more question, and then I'm just going to come to Galina before we before I hand it over to Peggy here. You know, it's one for you, Florian, and maybe Secretary Glickman wants to come back as well on it. There's a question about whether or not you see cultivated meat becoming more popular in the US and more plant-based proteins in Europe. Do you think that the two would diverge, or do you think there's a market for both?
I personally believe there's a market for both. One thing that we will see that one size fits all will be less and less. Actually, personalization will increase across. I know we're talking a lot about the transatlantic, relationship, but the first official regulatory approval was in Singapore just a couple months ago, right? Where the first cell-based chicken is now being served in a few restaurants. So this is, again, I want to stress that global point of view around these things. Consumer behavior, there's even a generational shift. They will view these things differently. They'll look at the they will continue to look more at the sustainability footprint of food. I think we will have to tell those stories more clearly, and that's very much true. And I view that these different product offerings will coexist. There will be different people with different preferences, and I think I think there will be even more regional centers. So, for instance, in the U.S., it may not be evenly distributed. Maybe Silicon Valley and the coasts will adopt some of those things earlier, and so on. So this will be very interesting to watch. And picking a winner early would be it's not going to happen.
Grand. Secretary Glickman, I'm going to come back to you, and just maybe you might want to comment on that. But there was another question which if my memory serves me correctly, Chicago Council's had a view on this. There's a question about how the US and European research centers should work more closely together with African research centers to solve some of the food security challenges that continent faces. So maybe I can throw that back to you, sir.
Yeah, I just, if you can hear me okay, first of all, I agree totally with Florian. It's different strokes for different folks. And a lot of this depends on taste too. If it doesn't taste good, it doesn't matter how wonderful it is.
No chance.
But I do think there are various markets. Now I think some of these markets are probably more suitable for the developed world. Some places in the developing world, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, you know, it's really hard to make a lot of these changes when you struggle just on the basics of trying to be an effective force for agriculture, farming, and do it profitably, as Galina has talked about. So at different places. On the African thing, the Chicago Council has been very involved in trying to develop bilateral relationships between major American land grant institutions and African research institutions. I've been to one myself in Tanzania, and I think that we could do a lot more in that area than we've done now. There's just such great promise in African agriculture. When you look at the volume of the land mass, the upside potential is just incredible.
No doubt.
Absolutely. Well, that's terrific. Really great answers there to some challenging questions. I'm just going to go to Galina maybe as the last part before I hand over to Peggy. Galina, you've listened to what our esteemed colleagues have told us. Are you more or less or reassured by transatlantic cooperation and what it can deliver for you now than what you were at the start? What do you feel about the way the discussion has gone?
Well, I certainly started and joined this discussion by believing that transatlantic cooperation is possible, and seeing so many people that think alike has only made me more positive about it. I think we definitely have things to contribute that will make both sides better off. And I think that if the goal is the same and our goal is obviously we need to change something, so let's find a way to do it in a way that is workable and possible, then I don't see why we wouldn't cooperate. It's basic common sense. So yes, I'm more positive, and I hope that we can find the practical solutions, because what we want is the same. So it's just a matter of how we get there.
All right. Well, thank you, Galina. I'm about to hand over to Peggy to wrap things up for us, but just to say big thanks on behalf of all our partners and supporters to all of you, Secretary Glickman, Galina, Florian, Michael. Nikolai dropped off. He had to join another meeting, so he apologizes for that. But I've really enjoyed being part of this discussion. There's lots of questions that have been coming from the audience. We'll try and follow up with those that we didn't get to. But for now, I'll sign off. Looking forward to seeing everyone at the annual conference on Tuesday. But for now, great pleasure to hand over to Peggy to wrap things up.
Can you hear me? Oh, great. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for the technical hiccup right here for a moment. So thank you so much to Mark and our panelists in the audience. We've had a robust discussion on strengthening transatlantic cooperation for research and innovation in the global food and agricultural system. And I have the daunting task of being able to summarize all of this in the next 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, but I'll attempt to do so. And reflecting on the challenges that we face in our food and agricultural system, and being able to address public health and nutrition with under and overnourished people, food waste, biodiversity, extreme weather events and climate change, humanitarian aid, and aging farmer demographics are certainly daunting challenges for all of us to be able to think about. And Secretary Dan Glickman started us off by talking a little bit more about how we saw a retrenchment of US engagement in global affairs recently. But the new Biden administration in the United States is showing a reversal of this stance and rebuilding trust with our allies, which is a positive move, as the EU-US relationship has been incredibly valuable in the past. This relationship has been strong since World War II, and both Secretary Glickman and Nick Stefanuta agreed that we can build on this solid foundation to create greater mutual understanding, greater confidence, and greater trust, which can withstand changes in administrations and commissions. Agricultural research can and should be a key starting point in which we build a new era of collaboration, specifically on the relationship between agriculture, nutrition, and health, and other areas as well. Secretary Glickman also noted the need for renewed priority for investment in funding agricultural R&D in the United States. I absolutely agree with Secretary Glickman, as the science and technology have the power to change the world. Renewing our global food and agricultural system will require thinking outside of the box, which will require collaboration and partnerships that can enable new thinking that generates new ideas. And it requires concerted efforts not only across disciplines and sectors, but across borders and countries to more effectively address challenges like the global pandemic as they arise. So Nick Stefanuta mentioned his efforts in addressing deforestation and the loss of biodiversity, forest fires, droughts, and soil loss. He was also encouraged in noting that the Biden administration is claiming leadership on environmental-driven concerns, and in being able to take a look at whether or not we can have mutual understanding on standards across the EU and US on issues like biodiversity and the farm to fork strategy. Both Mr. Stefanuta and Secretary Glickman believe that we could be doing more beyond the imposition of trade tariffs, especially in addressing public misconceptions about issues, and being able to see something like a transatlantic technology council. And that should not be the only collaboration that we see, but in being able to advance research practices as well. And being able to advance those research practices to the field, Ms. Pecheva mentioned her perspective as a farmer with regenerative agriculture and sustainable food production. And the panel briefly defined regenerative agriculture is about renewing land, water, and our natural resources. It's an investment in renewing through our food system. It also requires knowledge of local and land and climate, and from Galina's perspective and experience, it takes considerable time, as it took about 10 years through trial and error for her to understand what was the best practice for her. And sometimes these best practices are not a one-size-fits-all approach. So farmers may not be able to bear that economic cost. So it will be up to researchers to be able to show them those benefits with positive balance sheets. As the farmers are critical stewards of the land and of the environment, they are on the forefront in tackling many of the challenges that we see on our planet. And we need to be able to better equip farmers like Galena in the future. Mr. Doan from the Nature Conservancy echoed these comments, and he started off by addressing farmers as nature's economists. And he mentioned about how his work has in healthy soils with 200 demonstration farms, they were able to implement new practices while learning together to give rise to a platform of trust while addressing climate change and turning agriculture into a net carbon sink. We do need innovation, and not only innovation on the field, but also in policy as well, in being able to integrate the environment with agriculture and in creating government structures and incentives for innovation for the farmer all the way to the consumer. Florian Schantenman talked a little bit more about partnerships from his perspective with Cargill and how partnerships are critical. And when asked the question about how easy would it be to partner with companies, we would need policies around issues like intellectual policy to be able to more easily facilitate public-private university type of partnerships. And we are incredibly motivated by addressing crises issues like COVID-19. So it's absolutely possible for us to be able to rise up to these challenges, to be able to address some of the greatest challenges that we face in our lifetime related to the food system. And so I hope that today's dialogue has not only been informative for you, but inspired you on how the EU and US can collaborate in forging a better future together. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Mike Doan, Secretary Dan Glickman, Galina Pecheva, Florian Schantenman, and Nick Stefanuta. I would also like to thank our moderator, Mark Titterington, and FFA for hosting this month-long discussion on food systems and for being a terrific partner for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And last but not least, on behalf of the speakers and event organizers, I would like to thank you, the audience, for taking time to join us for this dialogue. We hope you can join us next week for the FFA 2021 Annual Flagship Conference. Have a good afternoon and good evening.
Bye. See you.
Cheerio.
Okay. Thanks.
On behalf of all our partners and supporters in the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, we hope you've enjoyed today's event. For more information and details of other activities that has taken place during the FFA's month of March, please go to our website. See you again next time.